Welcome everybody to the repo training. We're going to be talking about how the repository server works within decisions and how to move your projects inside and outside of the repository server from going from dev to repo to prod. A couple of things that we'll want to understand when we build in the repo is we got to understand the actions on how to set it up. We're going to talk about the life cycle, and we'll talk about branches, their actions and purposes, and then we'll talk about and mention some common repository errors. So the first things first, let's talk about the repository action setup. So the first thing you're going to do is you have to go inside your dev servers and your prod server, and you have to configure them to point to the repository server. This will allow you to have a right-clickable action on your projects or on your designer folders for that matter to right-click them and then say I want to check this into the repo. But you must have this setting configured in the first place, and in the dev server and the prod server there is a repo folder or a repository folder where you would set this up. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate this before we talk about the next thing. This is going to be my environment where I will play the role of a dev server. As you can see here, I have dev2. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that I go into my settings. And I need to make sure that the designer repository settings are set in this server. So if I go here to repository settings, I have it all connected. I got the try repo. I also need to make sure that I check the show repository actions. This will allow me to have that action that I need to be able to right click and send projects to the repository server. So once I have this, I'm going to save that setting, and then now I can start building a project. So I'm going to build a really quick project so you guys can see what that lifecycle looks like. So this is going to be JRod project. I'm going to create this, and then I'm going to just create a flow. We'll call this JRod flow. And imagine that this thing does something intelligent. I'm just going to leave it blank because I don't need to configure something to illustrate how the repo functions. I just need to have a couple of designer elements that I can group into a project to be able to demonstrate the repository capabilities. So that's all that I'm doing here. All right, so now that we have the project, like I said, I'm just going to move this folder to root so that I can easily have it up at the top level of my folder tree here. So I got my JRod project, and now because I enabled those actions for that repo server, and I connected it to the repo server in the settings, I can now right-click, and now I have this designer repository action here. Now, I always will have to create a project. Notice that the project field to the right of my screen is blank in both the rule and the flow. But now, when I want to add it to the repo, I have to put a project for this. So I'm going to call this JRod's or JRod project. So not only is the folder name project, but I'm actually going to make it JRod repo project, just so there's a distinction between the two names. And so now when I do this, I'm going to make sure that I add the folder and content. You'll see these 4 checkboxes here. One says, hey, you want to include the subfolder. So if I created a normal folder within this project, that will get carried over. If I have any dependencies from different projects, I can say, hey, add those into this project as well, and then exclude the history and hidden items folders. Basically, if I delete items, I don't want them included. And history folders, all my testing, I don't need all my test scenarios carried over because it bloats the file. So now I'm going to click next. It's going to show you all the 3 things it will commit, which will be the designer folder, my flow, and my rule. I'm going to commit now. And once I commit, I will have to type something here. And I'm going to say this is my first repo project. Boom. And then I'm going to commit this. So as we commit this, you're going to see this progress bar that just says, all right, checking in. And then once we see a success, so we have JRod repo project, branch trunk, and success, and then the revision number of that branch. So now I've successfully checked this into the repo. And before we go into the repo to view it, I want to talk about the repository server in regards to trunks and branches. So trunks and branches are handled differently in decisions than in traditional repositories. So in traditional repositories, you can all have different versions of the same flow that you can work on, or the same object you can work on, just on different branches. In decisions, that's not the case. In decisions, the repository server, everything gets added to trunk. Everyone builds on trunk. Everyone checks in their changes to trunk. Everyone adds all of their designer elements into trunk. And trunk is where all the development work happens. Now, when a build is considered stable, meaning that all of the development is done for trunk, then that's when you create a branch from trunk, which is just a copy of what trunk was at that given moment based on the revision number you decide to copy it from. And then what you can do is that is your version 1 of prod. And so once you establish that that's your version 1 of prod, then you can go to your production server and check out that specific branch of that project. And we're going to illustrate this here just so you can see that play out. So I'm going to exit out of the slides and we're going to go into the repository server. So this is now my try repo, or my example repository server that I set up to illustrate this. So I'm going to go into the studio and I'm just going to refresh this so we can see it. In the designer repository server, you'll see I have several other projects that I've added, but the main one that I created was the JROD repo. And you'll see that I have the trunk. And you'll see that I have the revision numbers indicating the version that I've checked things in on. So now let's say I really like this version. This is prod 1 for whatever reason. I want to say this is prod 1. So now all I need to do is I just need to right click and say I'm going to create a branch. And this branch, I'm going to call this as production v1. And then I'm going to click save. And what you're going to see is going to happen is as soon as I refresh this menu here, you're going to see I have now another project here separate next to the trunk. So I go to JROD repo and now I have production version 1 and trunk. Now let's say I'm still building, right? I'm creating new versions inside of the trunk. So I'm going to go back to my dev server. And now you can see here that let's say I want to create a report. I'm going to add some new features. So this is going to be new feature report. Right, and I add this and pretend that it reports on something really useful, right, just for the sake of demonstration. I'm going to create a form, same thing, pretend that it's useful for sake of demonstration. So pretending useful form, right, and let's see if I can actually spell pretending right. So I'm going to create this. And I'm just going to close it, right? We got this form. That's all I needed here. Now I decide I want to check in these changes into the repo. So now what I can do is I do the exact same thing. I go to designer repositories, but notice since this is the second check-in, I have different options. I can check in a project or I can check out a project. In this case, I want to check in the project since I know I have the most recent version of production, or of trunk, excuse me. And now what I can do is I can say this is adding new features to trunk. And then I can commit. And then now you'll see I'll get a new revision number, revision 190. And so now if I flip back into the repo, so that's what you're going to see me do right now is I flip back into the repo. I'm just going to refresh this because I made a change. I'm going to go back into my folders. Going to go into the designer repository and I'm going to click on JROD repo and I'm going to look at trunk and you'll see now I have different versions of this, right? So now I have the version 190 and 188. So what this is telling you is that, hey, this flow hasn't changed in revision 188. So this revision number stays the same, but I have added the new feature report and pretending useful form into this project. So this came in at revision 190. And so that's where you can see all those changes happen there. Let's say I'm going to do another thing. I'm going to edit the flow. So I'm going to go back into dev and I want to edit this flow. And let's say I'm going to add the run rule step and I'm going to combine that rule that I created earlier and I'm going to put this in this flow, and let's say I'll add like a create data step, right? Pretend that this does something interesting, right? I know right now it doesn't, but pretend in your mind that it does. And I'm just going to grab a create data step right here so that we can connect all this processes up, and then I'm going to connect this. So now I've designed my flow. So now I've added this change. I actually want to update. Now, I don't need to update the entire project. I can just right-click and go to designer repository and just check in the change of that specific element. So I'm saying, hey, I just edited this flow. I just want to check in this change. You don't have to do it for the whole project because this is the only thing that has changed. Now, I can still do it that way, But for the sake of this check-in, I'm just going to use the repository element and check in just that element. So I'm saying here I configured the flow to do stuff, right? Then I commit, and then you'll see a different revision number pop up, revision 191. And now what you'll see, I'm going to flip back into the repo. Now what you'll see after I refresh to get these changes to come on in, and then I go back into Designer Repository, I go back into the JRod Repo app, I go back into Trunk. Now you'll see that the flow is on a different revision number right here. So because that's the only thing that changed. So this gives you a lot of different flexibilities and avenues to determine how you want to view your projects. One thing I'll add, let's say I'm going to go back to dev, and let's say I want to actually delete the form. I realized I don't need the form, I just need the report. So then I can delete that form. And now I want to check in the entire project change because I made an entire project change where I deleted this form. So now I'm going to click on the project folder, I'm going to check in changes, and then it's going to detect, hey, you deleted this. Check this in, and I'm going to say, yep, I deleted the unuseful form. I check in, and now I have a new revision of 192. Now, why am I showing this? You're probably getting the habit of, okay, I see you can click on the element, you can click on the folder. But what I'm showing here is I'm showing that now when I refresh this, is the repository server can display what elements are deleted from different versions. So right here, I can go ahead and see like, hey, this one's deleted. And you may say, hey, I really want to, I want this to be undeleted, or, I want this back. You can either undelete the element here, or you can say, let me go back to the most recent version change. So in this case, I want to go back to my recent project version, which will be where I configured the flow to do stuff. So I can right click here and I can say that I want to roll back to this version. And once I do that, I can click roll back, and then I can refresh. And now I have that useful form back, and I have new revision numbers, revision 193. And so now we can see where this all happens. So now let's say I updated this and I want to go back, and now let's say, right, I've done my development, it's ready for production. How do I get this project into production where my production server can use it, right? Because I have this whole branch. We never answered that question. So what we do here is we're going to go to our production server right here. And all we have to do is whenever you have a project, you can either right click here and you can go to the Designer repository. And what you can do is you can go into the repository folder that resides on every single prod or dev environment. Where it specifically is located is it's located in the settings folder, designers, and then designer repository, or specifically the repository right here. It's this actual folder. And here's where you can check out or update projects. What I've done is I've added it to the favorites by clicking the star, so I don't have to drill down into the system folder. I can just click on favorites here and left click on this folder. Just a pro tip there. So now what I want to do is I want to get that production version 1 project into prod. I click on this button here, and notice I have access to all of my different projects. I want to grab the JRod repo project, and instead of grabbing trunk, because remember, that's where all the development happens, so I'm going to click on this dropdown and grab production version 1. And let's say there's multiple different revisions in production version 1. I can click the advanced tab and I can, or checkbox, and I can say I want to grab the date of this particular revision or a specific revision number. Or if I'm happy with just what is the most recent one, I can just grab this. And when I check this out, you'll see that it will show you what will be added. I can click continue, and then now I click continue again to go ahead and install that project. And once that is done, you will see that this project has now been added into my production server, and now my production end users can use it, and then I can move on to building onto this project, or I could even start new projects. So now if I go back into my folders, you'll see that now I have the JRod project folder and all of the elements that resided from when I cut that branch. So that's what happened there. And that's why I only have those two flows. If I want to cut another branch with the new data that I have now in trunk right here, since I have a lot of extra stuff, I can say, hey, I want to create another branch, and I'm going to call this production v1.2. Right, and then I'll have another branch that I can then utilize. And then all I need to do in that regard, once I refresh so that you can see it appear in the repository server, JROD, production 1v1 or production v1.2, excuse me. And then now when I go back into my repository server or my production server, but I go to the repository folder, I can now say I want to check out project or check out our update project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the repo project, but in this case, I'm going to grab production 1.2. And when I check this out, you'll see that it will update pre-existing elements that I already have and add the new ones I don't have. And so now when I continue this, I continue, right, and the same information happens. It will run the process, it will add it there, and then upon completion of this form, I will have the updated versions of my flow and rule and the new additions of the report and form. And that's how the repository works in a nutshell. Just to confirm, I'm going to go back to my JROD project, and boom, I have all of the different things that I added from cutting that branch. The last thing we'll talk about before we end is the life cycle of the repository. So this is in decisions what we generally utilize is what we call the repository life cycle. So in dev, that's where we build, right? You build in your dev server, you build a project, all that stuff is there. After you build that, then you have a QA section where you have some, you have either a dev or somebody go in and test that particular feature to see if there's any bugs. And then you get to UAT testing where you say, hey, let's get end users to test this, poke any holes or bugs into it. Then you go to performance testing where you can use Decisions Profiler or external resources like JMeter and .trace to test the performance. Then you go into staging, which is where you put your project on a server that replicates prod to see if you can catch any errors. And then the last and final stage is you have production, where you check out that project into production. And that's the repository in a nutshell. A couple of errors that you may come across, so we're going to skip down into this, is if your errors right here. If you're trying to, you have to make sure that when you check in projects into the repo, you have to make sure you have either an account that has access to the repo or that you have SSO configured on the repository server in the repository settings. The other error you can come across is that someone's working on a report and there's a newer version of this report in the repository server. How do we avoid that error? Basically, this is how the life cycle of development goes. A user at the start of their day, a decision developer, will check out the most recent version of trunk to make sure they have all of the most recent elements that have been developed. Then that whole workday, they'll be building, they'll be adding, creating new content, they will be combining content together, and at the end of their workday, whenever that ends, they will then check out those changes into trunk. And then the next day it starts again. You check out the updated changes of trunk, and then you work throughout the workday, and then you check out those changes at the end of the workday. So that's how we avoid the newer version issue here. All right, thank you so much for watching. That concludes the repository server demonstration.